Okay, so now we are going to go over amphibian appendicular skeletons. And I'm going to do both Necturus and Lithobates at the same time. Remember, we're doing both of these because we see some structures within Lithobates that are a good transition, and we see some structures in Necturus that are good transition. Ideally, Necturus is the one we would always use, but unfortunately we can't dissect the muscles on Necturus because they're no longer available. So we're learning both of them right now, so just bear with me. But as I mentioned before, a lot of these structures are going to be very similar, and that's why I'm going to draw both at the same time, just to show you a lot of those similarities. So let's do Necturus first. Once again, when I write the genus, I have to underline it, right? And so when we do Necturus, the first thing that we'll draw is our scapula. All right? I'm going to draw this as if you were looking at Necturus coming directly at you. All right? So this is going to be the anterior view here, and the posterior view is on the other side of the board. Okay? So if this is the scapula here, then this right here is going to be our coracoid cartilage. And we'll make this both sides. So you have the left lateral side and the right lateral side. This here was my scapula. And this is my coracoid cartilage. Okay? And I have the same on both sides. Just to note, something that you don't need to actually know, but it's there, is the suprascapular cartilage. That's at the very top there. And you would have it on both sides as well. And it kind of like bends in a little bit. But it's fairly small on Necturus. The ventral side of the scapula here, ventral lateral side, you would have your glenoid fossa. Remember, a fossa is just like a facet. It's like an indentation. And that's where you're going to have articulation with a bone. And in particular here, you're going to have the humerus. And over here, you have another glenoid fossa on this side, and you have the humerus on that side. Try to make my humerus look a little more bone-like, maybe. Should be longer than that. Sure, that'll work. Humerus. Okay? And then coming off the humerus, as you guys are familiar with human anatomy, it's the same thing when you're dealing here. So you would have your radius and ulna. You would then have your carpals, and this is a series of small bones. You then have your metacarpals. And then you have your phalanges. Okay, I know you can't read exactly what I'm writing there. I mean, maybe you can, but you can follow along with the book and you can see those structures there as well. And once again, this isn't the prettiest drawing in the world, but it allows me to see how each of these bones are in relation to one another. So when I'm drawing this, I can see that I have my scapula, my coracoid cartilage, my fossa right here, my glenoid fossa, and that's where the articulation is of my forelimb with the actual pectoral girdle. It's a girdle because it connects all the way across. Note, actually, in reality, these cartilages overlap, but they don't actually fuse together, so that there is not complete connection, but there is some connection there. Okay? And if I showed you our Necturus here, you can see those structures. You can see the scapula coming up. You can see the cartilage underneath laying on top of the board. It's that thin layer. And then you can see articulating with the scapula would be the humerus. You can see the two small radius and ulna. And then, of course, in front of those would be your carpals, your metacarpals, and your phalanges. So that would be for Necturus. Let's do Lithobates now. All right, and I'll keep moving out of the way so that you guys can see. If I turn my hand out to Lithobates, with Lithobates, you're going to have some similarities here and some slight differences. So first off, the big similarity is you have your scapula. Okay. Remember, this was the suprascapular cartilage. Here you have that suprascapular cartilage is way more pronounced. And it's on like a perpendicular plane. So if this is my scapula, my suprascapular is sitting just like this. Because it's so much more enlarged, it's going to offer a much larger site of muscle attachment. Next, I'm going to have another bone. I'll draw it in brown, because you don't need to know it. It's going to be just like that. And then it will fuse with another one off that side there. That is the procoracoid. Remember, we don't need to know the procoracoid. Maybe I overdid my suprascapular here. The procoracoid is taking the place of the coracoid cartilage, and it's really what's forming that pectoral girdle. Just similar to what we just went over, you would have right here your glenoid fossa. Remember, it was right here on Necturus. Then you have your humerus. And then you have a specialized fusion of the radius and the ulna, or actually one bone in the frog. So we can refer to this as the radial ulna. In front of the radial ulna, once again, you have your carpals. You have your metacarpals. And your phalanges. Same on both sides. And once again, our frog is positioned the same way Necturus is. Anterior is towards you, so our frog's sitting there looking at you like this. And you can see that on our frog here. You can see those two big like shoulder pads. That's the suprascapular cartilage. If I turn it this way, you can see that there's the scapula that's running from ventral to dorsal. All right, and I can't show you too much from this view, but if I move my felt to the other side, you can see those forelimbs going out. You can see the radial ulna fused together as one bone. Carpals, metacarpals, phalanges. The other thing that I want you to know with our frog here is that we're now starting to get a more well-developed sternum. And this is a good move into what we were discussing with Felis. Felis had a very well-developed sternum, remember. And so if this is anterior, once again, posterior to my procoracoid is my sternum. Remember in Felis we had sternibra because there were multiple sections of it. Here you have one bone, that's the sternum. Remember when we were looking at Felis, or mammals, you had the sternibra, and then the very bottom piece was the xyphosternum. You're going to have, once again, a xyphosternum being the most posterior piece of that. So this is posterior, this is anterior. If we look at anterior, we see that there's also some structures there, but we're not going to learn those. I'm just going to have you learn the homologs as we progress from amphibia to Felis. So we're learning the sternum, and we're learning this one here as the xyphosternum. All right? So that's not everything. One more piece, sorry. Notice here you have a bone running from side to side. Let me show you that again on my frog here. You can see the procoracoid forming the sternum, and anterior to that, you have this other bone running to the side. That's the clavicle on the frog. So we see structures here now that are more of a good transition between amphibia to mammalia, whereas with Necturus, we really saw a lot of structures that were more of a transition between Thesopodes and amphibia. And so you can start to see as we get through this evolutionary steps, as we go from something that has more ancestral characteristics to something that has more derived. So that's our pectoral girdle, and next we'll do our pelvic girdle. And we'll do the same thing. We'll compare between Necturus and Lithobates. And we'll do Necturus first. So Necturus, once again, has more of kind of an ancestral girdle, where a good majority of it is actually still made up of just cartilage. And I'm going to draw these a little different than what I just drew in those previous drawings. So for Necturus, I'm going to draw it as if it's coming out from the board. This is my vertebrae for Necturus. This is the vertebrae as if, once again, Necturus is staring you down, right? We're looking right down the body. So anterior is out here, posterior is through the board. This would be my sacral vertebrae, and this would be my neural canal, neural arch. I'd have transverse processes, and as we discussed before, you have these Y-shaped ribs coming off of those transverse processes. You can see those Y-shaped ribs coming off of the transverse processes as you go down the trunk vertebrae. And you have the same thing on the sacral vertebrae. You have ribs coming off, and these are known as sagral ribs. All right. Coming off of the sacral ribs, you then have a bone and this is the ilium, which I misspelled. This is an I. This is a capital I, just so you know. And at this point, you're kind of almost done with bone. In fact, let me redraw this. Because you don't need to know this structure. This structure here is referred to as the pubeo or the puboischiatic plate. The puboischiatic plate has a lot of different cartilage that are fused together as one big plate. It's got the pubic cartilage, the ischiatic cartilage, and it's this part in particular right here, that's the pubic cartilage. And you're going to see in Lithobates and also in Felis that you're going to have a pubic bone, and that comes from this cartilage here. You don't need to be able to identify it in Necturus because it's really just this big plate, but note that it's there. You do have two bones that are sitting in the posterior region. So this is posterior region, this would be the anterior region. And both of those are the ischium, okay? Or the ischia together. Ischium would be singular, and so that right there would be the ischium. And they're kind of just attached into that that plate, that cartilaginous plate. Okay? At the very base of your ilium, you have your acetibulum. This is another like fossa. It's a place of articulation. Have it on both sides here. And this would be where the femur comes off. And then the rest of this kind of follows with what you might be more familiar with. So after the femur, you'd have your tibia and your fibula, your metatarsals, your tarsals, your phalanges. If you equate this to what's in your hand here, your tarsals, your metatarsals, or your metacarpals in this case, are here, and these are your phalanges. Okay, same thing with your foot. Phalanges. And you have the same thing over here. that's Necturus. Lithobates is a little bit more complex. So let's jump over to Lithobates now, and let's look at the similarities between the two. So with Lithobates, see if I can't draw this well. I tried to practice my drawings before the videos, but we'll see how this goes. You are going to have, once again, your sacrum, and instead of looking down the animal, so instead of looking down my frog, I'm going to reposition my frog more so that we're looking at it like this. Okay. So this would be ventral, and we'll go from ventral to behind the board would be dorsal. So if I had my sacrum, and that sacrum has transverse processes, I then have very elongated ilium. That would be my ilium. Okay. And then connecting the ilium together, you have your ischium. Okay. Once again, we're looking at it from this point of view. Recall running down here. We learn the axial skeleton would be your urostyle. You have another bone that's sitting right here, and that's the pubis. And you'll see that's similar to what you see in Felis as well. At the base here, you once again have your acetabulum. Just like we had over there with Necturus. That's the place of articulation. For my femur. Similar to what we had with the forelimbs, with the hind limbs, you once again see fusion of the tibia and fibula. And so we call it now the tibiofibular. No R at the end, sorry. Tibiofibula. All right, you then have, and this part kind of tricks people sometimes, two bones right here. And they look like they might be the tibia and fibula because you expect two bones to be there for the tibia and fibula. But in fact, those are actually your tarsals. You then have your metatarsals, and then your phalanges. If you look at that with our frog specimen here, let me move my felt. You can see those two bones, right? Look very much like they should be the tibia and fibula. But you know, coming off of the acetabulum here, off of the pelvic girdle, is the femur. So if that's the femur, this next one should be where you see the tibia and fibula. But it's not. It's the fusion of both of them. It's the tibiofibula. So then the next ones must be the tarsals. Metatarsals, phalanges. So, yeah, there's a lot of terms that you guys need to learn, but they're all the same. And you're just learning where they now are found on this new taxa, so that you can see how we progress from one very simplistic fin that's on your bony fish to a more complex girdle that supports actual limbs, and how those limbs over time might become specialized. The tibiofibula here, and same with the radial ulna, would be a derived trait for these individuals. But how this then progresses into even felis, and that'll be our next video we'll talk about. We'll talk about mammals, mammalia, and how we can compare the anatomy of something like us and cats to what we're seeing here with some organisms that have more ancestral traits along that phylogenetic tree. But once again, most of these are going to be extremely similar.